I'm very happy to welcome you to Damaged Heritage, a presentation and discussion with J. Chester Johnson, who's here with us. And we're also very happy to see you here. So my name is Julia Renaud. I'm the exhibition manager and curator at the Center for Reconciliation in Providence, Rhode Island. And the center's mission is to foster racial justice and racial reconciliation by confronting the legacy of slavery. So we're so glad to have Chester here with us today to speak about his book. So as we do with all CFR programs, we'll begin with a statement adapted from the writing of Olivia McNeil, who's the Assistant Director of the Center for Students of Color at Brown University, and we thank her for these guiding words. So we would like to acknowledge the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples on whose traditional lands the state of Rhode Island currently exists. We recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this territory, and we recognize and respect the enduring relationship that continues to exist between Indigenous people and the land. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on this territory from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought each of us to reside on this territory and to seek to understand our place within that history. Beyond this acknowledgement, we also encourage everyone present today to reflect on the current communities of Indigenous peoples of whatever land you live on, and how you can live and work in allyship with those peoples. We would also like to note that the existence and legacy of the state of Rhode Island, as well as the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island, where the Center for Reconciliation now resides, would not be possible without the labor of enslaved and indentured Black people. We acknowledge, respect, and honor those whose forced labor allows us to work, live, and enter in community in this space. Thank you. So we have a wonderful program ahead of us. We're going to start with a presentation by Mr. Johnson on his recent book, Damaged Heritage, The Elaine Race Massacre and a Story of Reconciliation, which has particular resonance and relevance for all of us living through this time of deep pain and unrest around race and racism, and also deep promise for the ongoing work of racial reconciliation. I'll start off the discussion after Mr. Johnson's presentation with a few questions for him, and then we'll take as many questions from you as we have time for. So you're welcome to chat any questions you have to me directly, either during Mr. Johnson's presentation or during the Q&A session, and we will address as many of them as we can. I also want to add that although we unfortunately can't have an in-person book signing, Mr. Johnson has kindly provided us with free signed book plates that you can put in your copy of the book. So you can sign up for those. I'm going to drop the link in the chat. We have a Google form. You can sign up to get one, and supplies are limited. So please do sign up and we will send you one in the mail. So without further ado, I am proud to introduce J. Chester Johnson. J. Chester Johnson is a well-known poet, essayist, and translator who grew up one county removed from the Elaine Race Massacre site in southeast Arkansas along the Mississippi River Delta. He has written extensively on race and civil rights, composing the litany for the 2008 National Day of Repentance, where the Episcopal Church formally apologized for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. At the height of the civil rights movement and following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Johnson returned to the town of his youth to teach in the all-African American public school before integration of the local education system. Several of his writings are part of the J. Chester Johnson collection in the Civil Rights Archives at Queens College, the alma mater for Andrew Goodman, one of 3 martyrs murdered by white supremacists in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer. Johnson, who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury in the Carter administration, owned and ran, for several decades, an independent consulting firm for large domestic governments and nonprofit organizations on capital finance and debt management. His three most recent books are St. Paul's Chapel and Selected Shorter Poems in 2010, Now and Then, Selected Longer Poems in 2017, and Auden, the Psalms, and Me, also in 2017. His poem about the iconic St. Paul's Chapel, which was the relief center for the recovery workers at Ground Zero, has been the chapel's memento card since soon after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. There have been 1.5 million cards distributed. American Book Review said of the poem, Johnson's St. Paul's Chapel is one of the most widely distributed, lauded, and translated poems of the current century. One of 15 writers selected to be showcased for the inaugural Harvard Alumni Authors Book Fair in 2019, he was educated at Harvard College and the University of Arkansas, where he received the Distinguished Alumnus Award in 2010. So without any further ado, I welcome J. Chester Johnson.
Mute myself. Oh, there we go. Very good. Well, thank you very much, Julia. Good afternoon. I'm J. Chester Johnson, and I'm delighted to be with each of you at this event sponsored by the Center for Reconciliation to talk about my latest book, Damaged Heritage, the Elaine Race Massacre, and a Story of Reconciliation. The book, published by Pegasus and distributed by Simon & Schuster, was released on May the 5th. I became informed the middle of July that Damaged Heritage was an Amazon bestseller for biographies of social activists, so through Kindle. As we walk through the messages and contours of this book, I wish to underscore a crucial fact. Maybe I sound a little like I just left the Mississippi River Delta, though I've lived in New York City for many decades. Or maybe parts of the presentation sound apropos of headline Southern experience. But please do not assume this is a Southern book. It is not. While the South may carry a more glaring history of damaged heritage and its effects on racial subjugation, let us not be misled. Damaged heritage is a national problem, and wherever its use by whites against African Americans exists, then this book is relevant. I was asked to write the Litany of Offense and Apology for the National Day of Repentance, October the 4th, 2008, when the Episcopal Church formally apologized, with the presiding bishop officiating, for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. As I conducted my research, I came across a 70-page treatise entitled The Arkansas Race Riot of 1919, written by the African-American historian and anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells. It told of a terrible slaughter of Black sharecroppers and their family members, possibly the worst attack against African Americans in our country's history, with over 100 and possibly hundreds of Blacks perishing in Phillips County, located in southeast Arkansas along the Mississippi River Delta. I grew up in southeast Arkansas, one county removed from the site of the massacre. None of my friends nor I ever knew a thing about this terrible event. I never heard about it at school, in social gatherings, at church. As I was to discover, for virtually everyone in the United States, the Elaine Race Massacre didn't exist as a murderous act in American history. Partially out of sheer anger that I had been duped by the evanescence of uncomfortable history, I began to examine attacks in southeast Arkansas against African Americans around the time of the Elaine Race Massacre after the end of World War I, and found that there had been lynchings and burnings of Blacks alive in the area but none of these horrific and pernicious acts resulted in the 100+ deaths that occurred in the Elaine race massacre. I also began to recall a crucial personal story my mother told me many years before about my maternal grandfather, Lonnie Birch, the principal caretaker during the first 5 years of my life. She told me that when she was young, not yet a teenager, Lonnie, who had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, participated in what she called a well-known race riot, where many blacks were killed in southeast Arkansas. My father died when I was 1, and my mother didn't do well for several years, so I lived with my maternal grandparents, Lonnie and Hattie Birch. Lonnie had just retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and he became my 24-hour-a-day caretaker. He was singularly the most important person during my earliest years. I adored him, and he adored me. Over time, based on my research, I concluded that the Elaine race massacre and the well-known race riot my mother relayed to me about my grandfather were one and the same. The terrain, the location of the killing fields, the proximity of the Birch farm, the significant role played by the Missouri Pacific Railroad, Lonnie's only employer his entire working career, the large number of African Americans killed, and much more all led to the same conclusion. My beloved grandfather had participated in the Elaine race massacre. In 1957 and 1958, this story about Lonnie and Elaine, together with a discussion about the then current racial turmoil, found their way into conversations between my mother and me when I was a young teenager. At the time, a nearby federal state constitutional crisis was unfolding before us on television, radio, and in every newspaper. This crisis surrounded the integration of Little Rock Central High School, 100 miles away from Monticello, Arkansas, where I then lived. The subject of white racism, including its tragic and emotional divisiveness, has been with me ever since. I've studied it, I've spoken and written about it. It has also affected my life's physical migrations. During the summer of 1964, I sat in Quincy House along the Charles River at Harvard University. It was the summer before my junior year at Harvard. In June and July, hundreds of mostly white Northern students descended on Mississippi to register black voters, to upset the state's racial norms, to open schools and political operations. All this cumulatively known as Freedom Summer. While the target of this Northern advance was institutionalized racism, the geographic area given most attention was Northwest Mississippi, the area of the state conventionally known as the Delta, the sister locale just across the Great Muddy from Arkansas, from Phillips County and Monticello, my hometown. No wonder then that I dwelt repeatedly on accounts originating some 1,500 miles away. In the summer of 1964, the United States embarked on a racial reckoning, a battle beginning with the South as the target, but flaring into a national outrage for racial grievances everywhere. With black and white players frequently bearing a Southern accent, one heard ancient outcries for and against moral and human rectitude. Many of us think of that summer as the fulcrum, a torque that sent the nation into a racial revolution that has never ended. First, 3 civil rights workers with Freedom Summer were martyred in June in Neshoba County, Mississippi, followed by 200 federal investigators flooding the county to find the bodies of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. A search much of the nation followed with intensity and sympathetic anger. Then in July, the first seminal civil rights legislation of the 20th century was enacted by Congress and President Johnson around the same time that the Harlem race riots erupted as a harbinger of internal combustions and infernos for succeeding summers when ghetto riots spread like viral wildfires through American cities, one after another. A monumental question arose for me then. Should I continue to observe from afar in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or encounter for myself a turn toward the other side of history? Looking back over time, I don't think I had a choice. For 3.5 years, I returned to the South and traveled through the region. I held a couple of jobs, wrote, and now and then attended classes at the University of Arkansas until I accumulated enough credits, together with my Harvard credits, to graduate. When I left Harvard in 1964, I came back to the South after Freedom Summer, mainly as a student, although I had my inclinations and underlying suppositions about the country's racial revolution. By 1968, as I left Arkansas for New York City, I had a firm grasp of myself in the context of race and the Black liberation movement. Then, following the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., I returned once again to the Mississippi River Delta, to Southeast Arkansas, but this time I put my more congealed and codified views about race and Black liberation to work by teaching in an all-African American public school before integration of the local public education system. The significance and symbolic relevance of Freedom Summer are often dismissed today, intentionally so by many whites, I might add. For example, the following bit of history is usually forgotten or misplaced in retrospect. But Ronald Reagan, immediately following the Republican convention that launched his 1980 campaign as the party's nominee against Jimmy Carter, chose as his very first campaign stop Neshoba County, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers had been brutally murdered by violent segregationists at the beginning of Freedom Summer. Reagan's states' rights message that early fall day in 1980 in Neshoba County was meant to appeal to those whites, both in Mississippi and across the nation, who had seen the 1964 racial liberation efforts in Mississippi coming from the North as a Sherman-esque invasion to perpetrate unwarranted and prodigal attacks on justified and long-lasting white supremacy. I grew up in an especially racist family in an especially racist region along the Mississippi River Delta, a region that heads of the NAACP had dubbed the Heart of Darkness, a region that has also been called part of the American Congo. 5 years after the Episcopal Church apologized for its role in slavery and related evils, I wrote a 10,000-word article for a literary magazine on the massacre, which started a journey to reconciliation and deep friendship with Sheila Walker, a descendant of African Americans who were victims of the conflagration in Phillips County. Sheila wrote the foreword to Damaged Heritage. I learned something disturbing about myself through the writing of that article. Notwithstanding the preponderance of facts and evidence that Lonnie had participated in the massacre, I used the term likely to describe his role. I had no excuse for using the ameliorative word likely. Shortly thereafter, though, as a result of my long-standing rejection of the racist apparatus that surrounded me during my youth, I simply could not let my feelings and familial attachment for Lonnie erase or obscure the image of the racist person he had so clearly been. He then became and remains two distinctly separate people: a dutiful and caring grandfather from a less welcomed memory, but also an abhorrent gunman who sought to kill African Americans in a 1919 mass murder. My use of the term likely ultimately caused me to explore ways white Americans have frequently reacted to their collective and individual damaged heritage that has brought subjugation to Blacks over generations and several centuries. As a result of this personal challenge, I came to uncover the ability of generations of whites to tolerate the terrible treatment of Blacks in America. I acknowledged my attempt, as so many American whites, especially large numbers of white Southerners, had done before me, to lessen the effects of damaged heritage. It is crucial we understand that white folks have shielded themselves from damaged heritage through the adoption of an excessive veneration of ancestors, the past, and traditions, a feature Webster calls filial pietism. I believe both damaged heritage and filial pietism taken together are serious components of long-term and continuing racism. In fact, the influence of damaged heritage on white racism bears little potent capability without the psychological cover from filial pietism, which has excused, camouflaged, and sufficiently inoculated damaged heritage throughout our national history. We humans are not born with racism as a natural result of who we innately are. Rather, is a trait we absorb as a condition of what we learn and have to unlearn if we are to free ourselves from this evil. I like to think that the commonality between all peoples, let's call this commonality the genuinely human, far outweighs any differences in custom, history, background, skin color, manners, and rituals. Unfortunately, meager differences in these facets between us have often suggested to many whites the perfect reason for exclusion, separation, and isolation of others. With the genuinely human in mind, I recall comments for guidance from the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote 170 years ago that one generation does not learn anything genuinely human from a past generation. In other words, we have to learn ever anew for ourselves the genuinely human, which certainly proved to be a remedy leading to the last 6 years of reconciliation and friendship with Sheila Walker, descendant of Elaine victims. If we as a country and culture truly wish to rid ourselves of racism, then tradition and legacy have to take less part in our lives so that we create a society that bears increasingly less similarity to its historical practices and less veneration to the past. After all, adherence to filial pietism mirrors history when subjugation of Blacks was widespread as a central and acceptable component of white American life. In this respect, racial issues will disappear more quickly and more completely when we, Blacks and whites together, readily move away from any such impactful filial pietism and gravitate more fully and effectively to the genuinely human. We must understand that the genuinely human is decidedly different from those aspects that some folks have used to separate us: customs, traditions, skin color, accents, history. Rather, the genuinely human is deeper, more fundamental, instinctual, as it wills the connection between us to understand, to empathize, to reconcile, to love, to co-inhere, to step into another's shoes and be that person. So the genuinely human reflects our own individualized capacity and act to love, to express passion, understand, empathize, and reconcile. Kierkegaard's view that one generation cannot rely on a previous generation to learn the genuinely human warns us that filial pietism must and will inevitably embrace racism, at least in white America's case, since that revered past cast African Americans in a perpetual state of human subjugation. Therefore, we whites have to be especially careful today about those traditions to which we adhere. For if we're not, they will surely, as they have in the past, contain racist justification brought forth again and again. I believe my ancestors knew that their subjugation of blacks was decidedly wrong. The mere existence of filial pietism suggests that they used reverence for the past to shadow and hide damaged heritage. We would indeed be wise, therefore, to ask ourselves this question today. Are there traditions that we now blindly adopt for ourselves that directly or indirectly endorse racism and thus project their power and existence for tomorrow? And yet, we should also feel eagerly challenged that we alone can open ourselves to the genuinely human, not bound by those who come before us. During the writing of my 2013 article on the Elaine race massacre, I had reached out to the writer Robert Whitaker, author of On the Laps of Gods, the most definitive book on the Elaine race massacre. I asked him several questions to achieve clarification for my piece. In turn, he asked if I would meet an African-American woman, a descendant of a family that experienced terrible white attacks during the massacre. I agreed. Sheila also agreed to meet with me, the two of us, progenies of the two sides. For our first communication in early 2014, Sheila and I had a telephone call that lasted 2 hours. We shared much personal information about our ancestors, victims, and perpetrator. We were both very comfortable with the conversation, notwithstanding some anxiety before the call. Several weeks later, Sheila and I met at her son's home in Boston. Whitaker picked me up at the train station and drove me to the house where Sheila's son, his wife, and their small children lived. As Bob pulled up in front of the house, I inadvertently peered at the second-story windows, and my eyes met those of a person I knew had to be Sheila. How long had she watched for us from the window? Sheila obviously shared a similar searching exercise I invoked in anticipation of that day. Immediately upon greeting each other, we embraced for a very long time. From the beginning, we meant to be the obverse, the alternative to the attitudes and episodes that characterized those early fall days of 1919 in Phillips County, Arkansas. Our friendship and reconciliation have now continued for over 6 years, with our spouses and children being brought into this relationship. Our journey, apparent from the outset, remained a road to reconciliation that recognized imperative history, which made sense of all we learned from beginning to end, discounting none of the most intrusive facts, regardless how uncomfortable. This is no small matter, for truth brought forward affects the way we act and react today and tomorrow. Based on revised and true history, we inevitably adjust our current behavior. For the relationship that developed out of our mutual history from the massacre, Sheila and I empowered our adherence to the genuinely human as a steadfast election on which we deeply depended. I've learned that we white folks often have a problem with racial reconciliation and forgiveness. Oh, there may be the seemingly affirmative comments about blacks and whites getting along, but that's not what reconciliation and forgiveness are. The getting along test doesn't solve it. Since Lonnie remained for me divided between my beloved grandfather and a person who participated in the massacre, Sheila proved to be a godsend. She circumvented my struggles with the ribbon composite of Lonnie's two personas by announcing both publicly in groups like this one and privately to my family and me that she forgave Lonnie more than I had. By forgiving Lonnie for his role in the Phillips County conflagration that produced attacks against her victimized ancestors, she deflated the potency of the damaged part of my tradition. By her forgiveness of Lonnie for his tendentious racist opinions and conduct and role in this massacre, she conveyed to me the assurance that I could proceed with her to friendship through a closer, honest dialogue, shared views, and personal stories. A shared purpose, if you will, and on this foundation, a willingness and aspiration could be created between us. Without the prospect for forgiveness, exercised by those who sustained white aggression and who continue to carry long-term effects of the associated oppression, whites with the consequential impact of multi-generational damaged heritage are simply not able to forgive themselves. They have no resources for such a forceful act. Indeed, whites in general aren't into forgiveness, even the acceptance of forgiveness, which I believe is necessary for racial reconciliation. We always knew within ourselves that we could only be cleansed by those we had made our victims, Black brothers and sisters among us. By so many measures, we whites must depend on African Americans to help guide us in a direction that will also allow us to forgive the what and who that have defined us in ways we do not yet admit, and for so many, unfortunately, still choose to admire. More particularly, the use of forgiveness elevates African Americans and at the same time releases whites to be free of their traditional commissions, to turn whites from their historical participation in evil. Racial reconciliation strips away the previous context and replaces it with one that has set aside the evils and ravages of damaged heritage and filial pietism. One that has more fully taken on the adoption of the genuinely human. To receive another situation captures the will of one's own purpose, thus finding oneself in the place of another. Further, for someone connected to the oppressing side, historically speaking, this pursuit of the genuinely human and reconciliation with another of a separate race combined with an acceptance of forgiveness from those oppressed, can remove the self-destructive nature of a seemingly immutable past transmuted to the present. For someone associated with the oppressed, to forgive the historical oppressor is an act of freedom for both, which can serve as an illumination and passage to a consciously elevated relationship. Racial reconciliation means the making of color irrelevant to all facets of our lives, economically, socially, spiritually. I propose we bring this idea always into a fully human setting, into a setting in which we can relate to the genuinely human possibility. Simply put, to ourselves. Dealing with the special nature of race, we too often assign much of our own individual context to institutions, forsaking prospects we know we otherwise can bring entirely to bear between individual blacks and whites. While there is no doubt greater white activism at all levels is needed today in responding to racist episodes and comments, racial reconciliation is biracial, aligned with personally intense involvement. It is time for institutions to break open and free individuals of goodwill, black and white, to find each other in missions that result in authentic and public expressions for the genuinely human, depending instinctively on each other for the contact, sentiments, and humanity to circumvent obstacles embedded in so many past ways and habits. I've occasionally let myself lean into the following possibilities. What if we whites allowed ourselves to pursue and fully embrace the genuinely human, accepting the commonality of all human beings, superseding and obviating those marginal facets such as accent, skin color, customs, and the like that American whites have used to segregate themselves from blacks? If all of that could happen, shouldn't we be able to mitigate, if not suppress, the long-living influence of filial pietism with its excessive reverence for ancestors, the past, and tradition? And if that were to happen, how could damaged heritage survive from generation to generation? And if we could add a little forgiveness, exercised by African Americans, the equivalent of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the weapon of love, and if we whites could accept that forgiveness from African Americans, the kind of forgiveness that Sheila showed Lonnie, or the kind of forgiveness that the families of those killed at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston showed to the white killer Dylan Roof, isn't it possible that, dare I say it, we can contemplate something beyond, something over the mountaintop, and visions like those of King and Isaiah that speak gently to us all about one to another, black to white, and white to black? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chester, for sharing your experience with us and your insights, which, you know, even having read the book, hearing you share them in this setting, it's incredibly moving and gives a lot to think about, especially the concept of the genuinely human, which I think is very powerful. So I have a few questions to start us off, but I want to invite everyone to chat me your questions and also let me know if you'd like to be anonymous or if it's okay for me to share your name when you do, and we can, and I will share those as well. So I guess first off, I wanted to ask, so throughout Damaged Heritage, you emphasize the importance of establishing the full history of the Elaine race massacre, which was a history that had been manipulated and contested and silenced basically from the day after the massacre took place. And so, and you frame the establishment of the full history as really the groundwork for racial reconciliation. So a process of truth and then reconciliation. And I was curious, you know, you also talk in the book about your experience with holding conversations in communities in southeastern Arkansas, and ultimately organizing a memorial to the massacre that opened in 2019. So I'm wondering, given that experience, you know, why do you think establishing an agreed upon history is so important to the work of racial reconciliation?
Well, thank you, Julia. Well, I'm not the first to come up with the idea of the sequence of truth and reconciliation. As you know, the commissions in South Africa, they called it Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. So the idea is that, at least in my experience, that if an event is central to a relationship, and while the relationship that Sheila and I have experienced now goes beyond that of, and the experience that our own families have participated in, have beyond the event itself. But at the beginning, we had both studied the event and in separate context. And then when we came together, we felt that it was something seminal for us to experience this truth-telling. So that the truth-telling began and does as a general matter, and I think this is why South Africa did what it did, but it brings down the barriers of what otherwise could create a problem of communication and ultimately reconciliation. I mean, if I were disagreeing with someone over the factual circumstances of the Elaine race massacre, then we would be looking at each other in a different way, particularly since this is such an emotional event. Even though it's 100 years old, it's such an emotional event that it would interfere with reconciliation. And I actually do question our own ability to reach reconciliation without initially coming to the truth about germane events that occur between each other. When I was doing my interview, you were referring to a number of interviews that I conducted in Phillips County, Arkansas, in advance of my book. And one African-American man said, you know, and there has been, it breaks my heart, but there's been little reconciliation of blacks and whites within Phillips County. And it just breaks my heart. But one African-American man said, you know, we've swept all this stuff about the massacre under the rug, but then we keep stumbling over the rug. And I think that explains in so many ways why it is necessary that truth has to precede reconciliation.
Thank you. Another question. So the book, you know, really serves as a beautiful portrait of your friendship with Sheila Walker, who is the African-American descendant of the survivors of Elaine race massacre. And in the book, you call for that kind of individual interracial connection as the foundation for this work of racial reconciliation, and particularly in this critical step of Black forgiveness of white people. But, you know, I was reflecting that many white Americans often live in really racially segregated communities, meaning that many white Americans who might wish to pursue this approach could find themselves at a loss, at least initially, for a Black partner who really wants to embark with them on this journey, particularly in this space of forgiveness that can be so personal and kind of harrowing for both parties potentially. So how do you recommend that white Americans start engaging with the work of racial reconciliation if they don't have this partnership, at least at the outset?
Right. Well, what I'm saying here, again, going back, is not necessarily new. I made reference to King's term of the weapon of love, and also in my definition or discussion of the genuinely human, which is that it's below those areas that separate us, such as custom, traditions, history, etc. That is more fundamental, and it's or foundational, and it's deeper, and it's what drives the connection to us to understand, to empathize, to love, to reconcile, to co-inhere, and all, just to step in another's shoes and become that person. And that is the ultimate goal in terms of this, you call it partnership, which is or an experience being an ally. And in some ways, it's hard for me to see how one can be fully an ally in general sort of arc terms and not be an ally, on a personal basis. And there really are many opportunities that exist, and they don't have to be directly related in terms of personally related constantly. I mean, when Sheila and I had our first phone call, which I discussed here, we talked for 2 hours, we knew that there was something that was fundamentally already a strong developing relationship. We hadn't seen each other, and we did see each other. And the first thing we did when we saw each other personally in Boston was to embrace each other. And there was something fundamental we acknowledged what I would call the genuinely human electronically. I mean, this doesn't, it doesn't have to be one-to-one. It can be, relationships can exist in terms of even electronically. If people find it by living with, if white folks find that they're living in such a silo that there's not an ability, there's not even physically ability to develop a relationship. I mean, there's one African-American preacher, I heard him talking to a Black audience, and he said, if you don't know any African-Americans, then find some African-Americans. If you don't have any African-American friends, then make African-American friends. And it's that necessity that exists. My wife, who's a New Yorker, she grew up in a silo. She's a first generation American. She went to Forest Hills High School, and when she graduated, I had a graduating class of 1,300, and she said that there were probably 5 African Americans, but she understood the need, the personal need, for her to have a relationship with African Americans, for her to understand the Black liberation movement in a way that she didn't before. And she became a mentor for an African-American New Yorker, New York City. And they became extremely close. And the person who is her mentee treats her like a mother. And I mean, they spend an incredible amount of time together. And I think in those allied circumstances, we learn something about the genuinely human from each other that we cannot learn in any other way. And if people live in silos and not have the opportunity to physically, there are many outlets, whether there's arts, the area of the arts, the area of, there are plenty of racial reconciliation groups and Black liberation groups that can be contacted electronically. And so I'm probably blithering a bit, but that's my response.
Oh, thank you. So we've gotten a great number of questions, so thank you for sending them in. One from Vicky Acevero is asking about the churches in the Arkansas County, where you're from and where the Elaine, well, I guess the counties around
Right.
the Elaine race massacre, but kind of, what role they've played, what their relationship to all of this work has been.
Okay. Well, I'll say hi to Vicky. She's a friend, actually. And there's in Trinidad, as a matter of fact. You're not in Trinidad now, are you? Well, you should probably. Anyway, the churches in Phillips County where the massacre occurred were active and not active in the work that we did in creating the massacre memorial. One of the strange things is that the local Episcopal church was the church of preference for most of the descendants of the white planters who participated in the massacre. And so there was a white narrative that we had to work very hard in terms of dispelling, which we did, I think. And but the rector of that church really took a strong position in support of the massacre, the Black narrative of the massacre, and in turn the memorial that was dedicated a year ago in September. Bear in mind also, at least in Phillips County, it is a very depressed area economically. When the massacre occurred, and this actually goes to why the narrative was not outside the local locality, is that it was the county seat was the 6th largest city in Arkansas. Now it is living through absolutely, the same kind of depression that so many communities along the Mississippi River Delta are experiencing as a result of changes in agricultural economics. And so there's been consolidation of churches, but the churches actually attempt to work in the economic side of things. And other than the Episcopal Church, we didn't get a lot of support in terms of all that we were trying to do, which we held seminars and educating the people within the county as to why reconciliation is important and basic truths of the matter. We brought in a large number of scholars to do that, working with particularly the Episcopal Church, but not so much with the others. I would like to use this, though, for Vicky's question to talk a little bit about the Black church in the South, because it's a personal story with me. I grew up Monticello, my hometown, which was one county. Drew County is one county removed from the site of the massacre where I grew up, and it is hardcore Protestant. Or when I was growing up, it was hardcore Protestant. There was not a Catholic church. There were no Jews who lived in town. There was no an Episcopal church either. When I grew up, later on it did. But the churches, therefore, focus largely on the New Testament. But the New Testament, which has so much about neighbors, preaching was about the neighbors, but they never defined who a neighbor was. And that had a profound influence on me as I developed my sensitivity to Black liberation. And I found a real rescue to my Judeo-Christian beliefs through the Black church in the South, because there was no question the Black church recognized that who their neighbors were, and it was not confined on racial lines, while the white churches in my hometown never got to that point. And it was a bifurcation in many ways. There was a silence about certainly the extent to which Blacks were or were not were neighbors. So I'm tipping my hat. I went through a difficult struggle in terms of where I was in Judeo-Christian beliefs in my 20s, but the Black Church of the South rescued me by virtue of their absolute inclusion and courage and supporting the Judeo-Christian beliefs and the inclusiveness of who is my neighbor. So.
Thank you. I want to pass along a question from Dr. Cunningham, also known as Dr. C, who is a native Mississippian and child of the Freedom Summer, graduated from Tougaloo and Harvard. So he wanted to note those things as what you have in common. But he's wondering, what do you do about those who do not want to leave their silo to kind of embark on this journey?
We just have to keep working. You have to keep working at it. You can't give it up. Can't give them up. I have a friend that I started with. We started in the first grade together, and I'm still friends with him. And he was never quite as. He was never even close to where I was in terms of Black liberation. But we remained friends. And I invited him over to the dedication weekend for the memorial in Phillips County, along with other friends as well. But he came, he and his wife came and spent the whole weekend. And toward the end of the weekend, we had seminars and we had all kinds of different presentations and for the in dinners and that sort of thing on a communal basis. And he came up to me toward the end of the weekend, and he grabbed me by the shoulders and he said, "Chester, I love you," which is not unusual for him or for me to say it to him. But he looked at me and he was very tearful. And he wasn't saying, "I love you," but it was an epiphany for him. He became, his commitment and viewpoint toward Black liberation had seized him that weekend. And, it's here he is, he's 70 years old. And it's taken him a long time to get there, but he got there. And you just have to keep loving these folks, and you have to keep, and you also, but at the same time, if a person is inclined, has no interest whatsoever, there's a certain element of dusting getting the dust off your feet and leaving them. I mean, I was talking about earlier that there was a friend from Louisiana that my wife and I have had for 20 years or so. He read the book and he doesn't want to have anything to do with us anymore. And you can't grieve. You grieve over that to some extent, but you can't let that stop you. It's can't grieve that much about. I mean, I've got, I have family members who don't see. When I say family members, I mean down in Arkansas, who don't see the world the way that I see it, and they're not happy about the book either. Particularly those who have the last name Birch, which was my maternal grandfather's name, because they feel like they were sort of impugned by virtue of this. But that can't stop. You can't, it's got to be, you have to keep at it. But also those that are prepared to move in that direction, like my friend that I discussed, you can't leave them behind. You have to keep encouraging. You have to keep, because as one person that I know is very clear in all of this, that you have to give them, you have to handle people like who are in silos, but who are inclined to move in a direction. You have to sort of treat them like trapeze artists. You have to give them the benefit over here. There's something greater for you over here. We're there holding you. We will reach out to you, and there's something greater than where you are. And trust us. Move in that direction, because there is something that you have not fully understood. But don't give up. And I'm sorry, maybe I'm blithering. But
no, I don't think you're blithering at all. That was very powerful. I am aware that it's 6:02, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to many of your questions. I am copying and pasting them right now. And Chester, if it's all right with you, I can send them to you. And I think everyone who chatted me a question, I believe I have your email address. But if you're not sure, please chat it to me. But these were great questions, and I'm sorry we don't have more time.
okay.
And thank you, Chester. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Deborah Sharp, our Executive Director.
I have to unmute myself first. Chester, thank you so much. The book was really powerful, but hearing you talk about it was especially moving. And we really want to thank you for sharing your story with us. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to the questions myself. I would love that, but we'll catch up with that later. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. It was great to have you. I have a couple of announcements. One is during the month of October, we are resuming our walking tours, small groups walking tours on Saturdays and Sundays. And if you're interested in that, you can go to our website, cfrri.org, to register for a walking tour. Just for the month of October, and we are being very careful and staying very safe, trying to follow all the proper protocols in terms of distancing and wearing masks and that sort of thing, but that will be coming up. And our next webinar is scheduled for October 29th, and it's going to be on plantations, and I think that'll be a really interesting conversation. So please feel free to start looking for information about our next webinar. And if you enjoy the programs we're doing, we'd love to have you become more involved with us. You can make a donation or check out current events at cfrri.org. So thank you all for joining us. Chester, thank you again for being here.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Julia, did I forget anything?
No,
Okay.
it's perfect. Yes. And if you all aren't on our newsletter, please sign up there. And I also just dropped the link to get a signed book plate in the chat again. So feel free to
Great.
sign up there. Thank you all so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.